All right, so in this video, we will start our long discussion of German unification. So we'll start with German unification. But before we get into German unification, I think what we should do in this video is do a quick recap, not recap, but a quick discussion of what's been going on in Prussia kind of in the early part of the 19th century, so that we have a good understanding of why these things are going to happen in the subsequent videos. So what we're going to look at here in terms of German unification is a little bit of background on Prussia and the architect of German unification, Otto von Bismarck. So that's what we're going to look at here. Basically, what was going on in Prussia in 1848 and what was going on in Bismarck's early career. Another way of looking at this, instead of thinking about this as German unification, another way of thinking about this is another way of looking at German unification is instead to think about it as Prussian domination of the other little Germanies. Or another way to think about it is Prussian domination or replacement of Austria. Remember, Austria was Prussia's biggest rival, and throughout this process, what we're going to see is Prussia attempt to replace Austria as the leader of the Germanies, and that's what we're going to get. Bismarck, like Cavour, was a master of realpolitik. So if anyone is associated with realpolitik, it's Bismarck. Even though I think Cavour was the man who invented the term, Bismarck is its most famous practitioner. So what we're going to do here is kind of look at Prussia through Bismarck's eyes. In this video, through Bismarck's eyes up until the point where he takes over as the Prime Minister of Prussia in 1862. So we're going to kind of take this through 1862. When Bismarck is named Prussian Chancellor, which is their equivalent of Prime Minister. All right, so let's start with Bismarck's early life. So Bismarck was born in 1815. And it's kind of it's a coincidence, but it does kind of mark a turning point. He was born in 1815, the same year as the Congress of Vienna, and so he's usually seen as the latter half of the 19th century Metternich. So while Metternich was kind of pulling the strings in the first part of the 19th century, Bismarck is going to be pulling the strings in the second half of the 19th century. He was born in 1815 to a wealthy Junker family. So Junkers are Prussian nobles. So just like nobles in Russia are called boyars, in Prussia, the nobles are called Junkers. He was well educated and indoctrinated into Prussian military culture. And he didn't want to be a soldier. But in order to get ahead in Prussia, you had to act like a soldier. And really, his time in the military was meant to network, not be a soldier. So being a wealthy noble, he was able to be an officer in the Prussian military. That was not his end goal. He didn't want to be a soldier, but he spent that time networking and making friends in the government so that when he got out of the military, he would have the right contacts. After he left, he trained to be a lawyer. Like most of the other important people in this course we've looked at, Luther, Robespierre, a lot of them also trained to be a lawyer, and so did Bismarck. And in the early 1840s, he joined Prussia's diplomatic service. So he became a diplomat, which is what his goal was to be. That's what he wanted to be. Now, it's around this time Prussia begins aggressively industrializing. And this is pretty much led by the government. to benefit the military. As most things in Prussia were. So this is around the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution, and Prussia becomes a leader of the Second Industrial Revolution, like the UK was for the First Industrial Revolution. And in fact, Prussia overtakes the UK as the most industrialized power in the 1860s. So their production of steel, their production of weapons far surpasses the British, who were more or less happy to just sit on their laurels and just rake in what they had been making. They weren't really interested in innovating further, whereas the Prussians were rapidly moving past them. Okay, so back to Bismarck. In 1847, Bismarck is named to the Prussian, we'll call it a Prussian parliament, but it's more like the old Estates General. So he is a representative of the Junkers. So he's a representative of the nobility at this Prussian quote-unquote parliament. And he's named to this thing right as the revolutions of 1848 break out. Now, Bismarck personally was a conservative and a reactionary. So in that sense, he was very similar to Metternich. But he thought outside the box. And when these revolutions broke out, he convinced the king to allow elections with all men voting, which was what a lot of these revolutions were fighting for. And Bismarck says, let them vote. Let every man vote. Because what Bismarck knew was that regular rural people, which most of the people in Prussia were really conservative. And they would vote for whatever Bismarck and the king wanted. They would vote for what Bismarck wanted. And so what it looks like, Bismarck is a liberal. He even wears the symbols of German liberals. He wears their colors, the black, gold, and red. Which is today the color of the German flag. But Bismarck appears like a liberal. He even appears like a nationalist. But in his heart, he's actually a conservative. And what this is a really good example of realpolitik. Because it doesn't matter how you get to the goals. You want these conservative principles. You want to stop these revolutions. Instead of fighting them, give them what they want, because they're going to vote for what you believe in. So this is a really, really good example of Bismarck's use of realpolitik. So, after this, after 1848, Bismarck is appointed to a number of diplomatic positions all over Europe. So the first one is in 1851. So after the Frankfurt Parliament falls apart, there was I guess we'd call it a kind of United Nations, like a United German Nations, was created to facilitate discussions between the Germanies. And Bismarck is the Prussian ambassador. So he represents Prussia at this kind of little United Nations for the Germanies. And while he's there, he gets to watch the Austrians up close. And he's basically just gathering intelligence. And to be fair, that's what most ambassadors were doing at this thing. And in general, that's what most ambassadors do, period, is they gather intelligence. So Bismarck is there watching the Austrians and learning about what they're up to and how they operate. In 1857, he was appointed ambassador to Russia. And while he's there, he manages to kind of informally switch the Tsar's allegiance to the Prussians away from the Austrians. So he's gathering intelligence, he's making friends. In 1861, he's appointed ambassador to France, where he sees Napoleon III's, I guess we'll call them eccentricities, firsthand. He knows this is a guy that he can manipulate. And he will. And it's here in France that he comes to the conclusion after watching Italy unify that war is the only way to do it. War is the only way to do it. And so if Germany is going to unify under Prussian leadership, that's how he's going to have to do it. So we get up to 1862. The King of Prussia dies, and his brother, William, or as we will know him, Wilhelm, becomes the new king. And he appoints Bismarck to be his chancellor or prime minister. Now, Bismarck is not well liked. Just about everybody thinks Bismarck is a horrible person and a jerk to be around. But he's also seen as the most talented and capable person, so everybody just kind of swallows it. But nobody likes Bismarck personally. And it's at this point where he gives his famous blood and iron speech. Where he basically says that liberalism did not work to unify Germany. And he's speaking about the Frankfurt Parliament. The thing that will unify Germany will be iron and blood. And I'll end with this brief quote from the British Prime Minister. So the British Prime Minister, who had come to know Bismarck through all sorts of other diplomatic opportunities, read Bismarck's speech. And his name was Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli read the speech and said, "You should be careful of that man. He means every word he says." He knew Bismarck was not exaggerating. He knew that we were going to have a bunch of wars now because he's going to be pulling the strings in Prussia. And what we'll do in our next video is go through the first two of these wars. So we'll talk about the first one, which is the German-Danish War, which took place in 1864. And then the Austro-Prussian War, the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. Those two wars will really set the stage for the big conflict, which we will cover in a separate video between Prussia and France. So that's what we're going to do over the next few videos, is really dive deep into how Germany became Germany. So until our next video, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.